Hi, my name is Catherine Crisco, and this is my Mythbuster. So, the myth that I chose to debunk, so to speak, is that only students with severe disabilities are in special education. So, some personal connections that I have to this myth. One connection that I have to this myth is that I kind of used to think this way. So, my high school used to be a bomb shelter, and in the basement, there were no windows and we had very thick walls. So, I had a few classes down there during my junior year, and that area was where the special education room was located. And actually, before that, I didn't even know that's where that was. After our morning announcements, we would hear the special ed students screaming and laughing because we could hear them down there, and would often see them walking to get lunch before everyone else. And the only students I ever really saw had more severe disabilities, and so that's kind of what I connected special ed to. In my mind, I figured that due to my experience, there were only a few amount of disabilities that special ed covered, and that they were all severe. Unfortunately, it wasn't really until college that I fully understood that this just was not true. So, the time that I began to fully understand this was my junior year of college. I was in my first block of Watson, and we had to observe in a high school classroom. And in my school, the English class contained only students who had IEPs, as well as a special education teacher to help them out, which I had actually never seen before. Before observing, we were warned that this class might be a little more chaotic to witness compared to like our other ones. I was actually surprised that this class was my favorite one. They were all so kind and sweet and respectful of their fellow classmates, and most of them did have invisible disabilities. Invisible disabilities are ones that you can't see from looking at a student. So, an example would be like a learning disability, like dyslexia. You can't tell that looking at someone that they would have something like that. So, witnessing a classroom full of students with IEPs greatly changed my view of students in special education. I learned so much by being around them, and I truly loved that experience. And one of my favorite moments was there was a bell ringer where the kids were asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And one student said that his dad wanted him to carry on the family business and be a mechanic, but he really wanted to do something with like rocket science or NASA. And one of the other kids turned around and said, "Hey, dude, you gotta love and respect your parents, but sometimes you just gotta do what's best for you because you're the one that's gonna be doing it the rest of your life, and you just gotta do what makes you happy." And it was just such a sweet moment that I wasn't expecting, particularly from high school boys, because they do have a lot of pressure to not be emotional. And so to see that was just so incredible. And it was just incredible to see these children who are often stigmatized to be so supportive and kind to each other. And in all honesty, I wasn't expecting this classroom to be that functional, and found that I was disappointed in myself for thinking that way because I never met these students, but I already had an assumption based on the fact that they have IEPs that they would be the less functional. In reality, they were probably the most cohesive as a classroom because they really did feel like it felt like they were all friends. And along with that, it's a myth that's easy to believe because of how it's represented in our media. Whenever we are told or showed kids who are in a special education class, we're shown students who, upon appearance, have a recognizable disability. So, for example, when you Google special education kids, the picture that I have is the first one that pops up, and many ones very similar to it appear as well. We're never shown kids who have learning disabilities or any other type of disabilities that aren't recognizable by physical appearance. There is definitely a stigma with invisible disabilities because there are so many people who will say, "You must not have a disability because you don't look like you do." So when special education is represented, they try to pick students who actually look like they have disabilities. And this makes me a little sad because I have a form of epilepsy, and before being diagnosed, I was really not that aware of invisible disabilities and what that meant. So looking at me, you would not be able to tell that I have any sort of illness, and especially considering that I have my jerking/seizing under control. I don't really seize, I will jerk. You wouldn't be able to tell from that either because I don't do it anymore, but I still have epilepsy. So these biases still exist, and so it's no wonder that when people think of special ed, they only think that the classroom is filled with students who have a recognizable disability because that's all they see in the media around them. So who else really is in special education? Well, there are a multitude of children in special ed with a variety of different disabilities. And as I said, most people think that only children with severe disabilities are in special ed. However, under IDEA, a law that governs all special education services for children in the US, to qualify for special education, students must have issues in one of these categories: a serious emotional disturbance, a learning difference, an intellectual disability, having had a traumatic brain injury, being diagnosed on the spectrum of autism, vision and hearing impairments, physical disabilities, developmental displays, including speech and language difficulties, and other health impairments. So as you can see, that covers a lot of different types of disabilities. But even so, under something like learning differences or learning disabilities, you have common disabilities like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, auditory processing disorder, and visual processing issues. Excuse me if I pronounced any of those wrong. But so even under these very specific categories, there are still a multitude of disabilities that are not severe, but kids are still in special education for them. So moving on to specific numbers, this quote right here. So according to the National Center for Education Statistics, in 2018 to 2019, the number of students aged 3 to 21 who receive special education services under IDEA was 7.1 million, or 14% of all public school students. And among them, 33% had specific learning disabilities. So I have the chart. It might be a little difficult to read, but it's also in my essay, and it's a little bit easier to read there. So when we actually look at these numbers broken down, it's interesting to see what takes up the most of special ed. Excuse me. So as I said, 33% of students in special ed have a specific learning disability, while 19% have a speech or language impairment. So those are the top two, which I found interesting. 15% have health impairments, and only 11% have autism, even though that's the disability that most people associate with special education. 7% have a developmental delay, 6% had an intellectual delay, 5% had an emotional disturbance. 2% of children had multiple disabilities, and only 1% had hearing impairments or orthopedic impairments. This chart not only shows the massive amount of different disabilities in special ed, but also shows that the most represented disability, so to speak, actually only takes up 11%, which was just really interesting. And definitely shows that there is not merit in this myth at all. So talking a little bit about how the myth can damage people. So for one, having a myth like this can only damage the people involved even more. So when a student with a mild disability hears that they're being put in special education, those words can feel a little scary because of the connotations that come with them. So they'll often feel like they don't belong there or like they're displaced. If they were more aware that special education covers multiple kinds of disabilities, hopefully it would help them feel less scared by that and understand the purpose of it more. And the same sentiment goes for parents. Oftentimes, a parent will hear special education and feel immediately panicked because of the connotations that the word holds. If special education was represented by all disabilities and was normalized as something other than a quote for autistic or non-functional students, which is what most people see it as, it would probably help calm the fears of parents and students, as well as help them realize that there's nothing wrong with being in special education, and that it's actually there to benefit them. So here's the visual representation of this myth as well as the myth debunked. So as you can see, underneath the myth section sits a child with a physical disability, and though these children are typically in special ed, they're not the only ones. In the myth debunked photo, it shows a special education class from Pike County that was featured because someone donated equipment to them in their local newspaper. So this photo shows how a special education class can actually look. There are students who you can see have disabilities just by looking at them. But there are also students who, when you look at them, you would not be able to tell that there's any disability. This shows that a special education classroom is not simply severely disabled children, but actually rather diverse in the kids that they have. So, for my plan of action, I definitely want to normalize special education for students with milder disabilities. And I don't want that to sound as if students with severe disabilities aren't normal, because that is not what I mean to say at all. Rather that there's a certain connotation with special ed that you're only in there if you're severely disabled. And we need to normalize that special education helps so many different people with so many different types of disabilities, from mild to severe. Another thing is that if I have to refer a student in the future for an IEP, of course there is an IEP meeting, but I also want to sit down and talk with them and their parents and talk to them about what's really going on. I want them to know that getting an IEP and possibly being in special education can help the student and get them the accommodations that they need, and it does not mean that they have severe disability. Along with that, representation is extremely important in the media, so when talking about special education in the mainstream world, it would be helpful to represent more students than just the ones who are severely disabled. It would help the student who becomes a part of special education in the future to feel more welcomed and less scared when they're referred. Lastly, there definitely needs to be more awareness and less ignorance about invisible disabilities. The reason that other children aren't represented is because they know if they showed kids, and they, as in media and things like that, if they showed kids in a special education classroom who had dyslexia, people would wonder why they're there and then judge or make presumptions about them. But if there was more understanding surrounding disabilities that you can't see, this myth would not be as prevalent, and more people would be aware of the diversity in special education. Because in reality, a special education classroom should be a place where everyone feels welcome, no matter their disability. And that is the end. Thank you so much for your time, and